and then Black political publishing and Black activism. I divided the political activity into formal and informal political engagement because I wanted to encapsulate individuals across the class spectrum. Throughout the thesis and this paper, I will be using a few terms that will need to be defined. I use the term Black. In my thesis, I define Black as a person of Black African heritage. This includes individuals who were part of the African diaspora. I include within this definition Black mixed race people to encompass this group, I included individuals who had a great-grandparent who was Black. The contemporary term for someone with a great-grandparent with African heritage was Octoroon. The second term that I will define is political. I divided politics into formal and informal. Formal politics were activities that directly engaged the government or official political system, i.e. being an MP, voting, or participating in local government. Informal politics were activities organised outside the official political system, i.e. publishing, political literature, creating or joining a political society, outdoor meetings, campaigning, or taking part in other political actions such as rallies.
Clicking the screen, Helen.
I did it, it's fine. Okay, so voting. So the main part of my paper is about voting, and I wanted to include some images of poll books. This is the Westminster poll book of 1818, and it had full colour pull-out, which I think is off the polling day. Someone will know if that is not true. As many in this room will know, Ignatius Sancho was thought to be the earliest Black voter in Britain. He voted in two Westminster elections, 1774 and 1780. But Dr. Gillian Williamson has changed that with her discovery of John London, who voted in the Westminster by-election of 1749. During this project, I was able to identify 7 more Black voters. I did this by first looking into eligibility. Entitlement was a patchwork of criteria that varied throughout the country, and for my thesis, I was focused exclusively on income. Prior to the Great Reform Act of 1832, there were broadly 3 constituency types: university, county, and borough. The university constituencies in England were Oxford and Cambridge, and they returned 2 MPs to Parliament each. The franchise was in the graduates of the university. Before 1918, the franchise was restricted to male graduates with a doctorate or a Master of Arts degree. The county constituency represented 40 English counties and returned 2 MPs to Parliament. The franchise was in property 40-shilling freeholders, which were owners of property with an annual rental value of £2 or more. Counties were less contested than the borough constituencies, partially because of the cost incurred to the candidate for things like campaigning or transporting voters into the county town. The boroughs had more complicated system with 5 distinct franchise types, with some constituencies utilising 2 of these types at once. They were potwalloper or householder, which entitled an inhabitant to vote if they were not receiving alms or poor relief. Scot and lot, which entitled an inhabitant who paid local rates and had been a resident for a specific period before the election. Freeman, which entitled an inhabitant if they had gained the status of freeman, which allowed them benefits of trade and elections. The status of freeman could be obtained through birth, purchase, or apprenticeship. Corporation boroughs held the franchise in the borough's corporation, which could be something like a council of freemen. Burgage boroughs were the most restrictive type. The franchise was held in certain properties, burgages, and new burgages were not allowed to be created, making the electorate very small and fixed. After 1832, the system was simplified and gave areas that had previously not had representation in Parliament, such as Manchester. Some people who had previously been able to vote lost their right, and registration became a requirement. Property ownership was a key element, as well as residency in a constituency. 6 months was typical. Exclusions from the franchise were most types of tenants, men in receipt of poor relief, men convicted of certain crimes, and women. And a minimum age of 21 was instituted as well. Black people were not prohibited by an Act of Parliament from voting during this period. However, in 1731, the Lord Mayor of London had banned the employment of Black apprentices in a proclamation declaring that it is the order by the court that for the future, no Negroes or other Blacks be suffered to be bound apprentices at any of the companies of the city, to any freeman thereof. The City of London was a freeman borough, and this meant that Black people were unable to become freemen in the City of London and would therefore not be able to vote. However, none of the rest of the franchises specifically stopped Black people from eligibility. And to ascertain if an individual was eligible, I needed to consult a variety of sources such as newspapers, rate books, parish books, wills, land registers, and university qualifications. An individual's eligibility was established from learning the story of their life. So I created a short list of 22 individuals from my database that met the basic criteria of property ownership or weren't known to have been in receipt of poor relief. The shortlist consisted of individuals who were living in Britain during the period who I had identified as having been likely to have been eligible. 10 of them I knew owned property, 4 of them were MPs. Once I had the eligible voters, I needed to consult the poll booth for each one to find out if they had voted. I took the 22 eligible voters by using residential data that I'd recorded in the database. I found their corresponding constituencies. I then had to check if there were contested elections in those constituencies during the time that they had lived there, and then if there was a known poll book for that election. And I did this by using the hand list of English parliamentary poll books, 1694 to 1882, and the 18th century political participation and electoral cultural online database, or EPEC. The eligible shortlist demonstrates that there were Black Britons who were established in Britain, some who were embedded in elite and some who were embedded in elite politics. In the same period as chattel slavery and the Black loyalist refugees, there were Black people owning property and running businesses. Sancho is a prime example of an individual who was born into slavery, who was able through fortune and perseverance to establish himself in British society and history. Entitlement is a salient metric to use to communicate the variety of social positions Black Britons occupied in this period. And by looking at entitlement, you are able to incorporate wealthy individuals as well as people who were working class, demonstrating that Black Britons appear across those boundaries. For those who were entitled, but I did not find evidence of them voting, there are some notable figures. Joseph Emedy, who's pictured in that bottom picture there, playing the violin, was a renowned violinist who had been impressed onto a Royal Navy ship for 4 years before being discharged near Cornwall in 1779. He was a music teacher and a violinist in Falmouth. He then became the leader of the Truro Philharmonic Orchestra. I knew that once he had arrived in Cornwall, he didn't live anywhere else. So when looking for poll books to search for, I then found that Truro was a corporation borough, therefore had very few contested elections, and the franchise was very exclusive. The county, Cornwall, had one contested election while he lived there, which was in 1831, and I was unable to locate that poll book. Emody was unlikely to have been part of Truro's corporation without records being left that that was the case. So it's unlikely that he voted in Truro. However, the research indicates that he was eligible to vote in the county. York, who is on the far side, is an example of an individual who, through their political behaviour, you would have expected to have voted. He was the son of Samuel Redhead, a plantation owner on the island of Antigua, and a freed enslaved woman, Sarah Bullock, from Barbuda. He was likely eligible, however, he moved around a lot throughout his life, making the certainty of his addresses quite difficult. He spent 2 years in jail in Dorchester Castle for seditious conspiracy in 1795, where he met his wife. He moved to London somewhere around 1800. And he does not appear in the Westminster poll books for the elections of 1802, 1806, 1807. He also does not appear in the Middlesex poll book for 1802, 1804, 1806, or 1807. Caesar Picton, that's his plaque, on one of the properties that he owns in Kingston upon Thames. He was brought to Britain as a child from the west coast of Africa. He was bought by an army officer who gave him as a gift to a politician and lawyer, Sir John Phillips, along with a parakeet and a non-British duck. Caesar was favoured by the Phillips family and was given an education. He took the name Picton from the Phillips country estate in Pembrokeshire, and he was given a legacy of £100 in 1788 when Mrs. Phillips died. And in 1795, he had bought a property which he had previously been renting in Kingston upon Thames, which he was using as the premises for his coal business. He bought another property in Thames Ditton in 1816. The poll books consulted for Picton were Guildford, 1790, Surrey, 1806 to 1826, and in that period there seemed to be 7 contested elections. And then later there was a contested election in Guildford in 1835 and in West Surrey in 1835. However, I couldn't find him in the voter registers for the later elections, and I didn't find him in any of those poll books. Onto the voters. So on this slide, there's a table of all of the 9 voters, including Ignatius Sancho and John London. They are arranged in chronological order from the first known vote of each person, and they're showing a lot of detail. For each election the voter took part in, who they voted for, and who won in those constituencies. So it is detailed, but I'll keep it up while I'm talking about each of the voters. So from the short list of 22, I was able to find 7 additional Black voters. I was unable to find anyone voting earlier than John London in 1749, but I found 2 earlier voters than Sancho. The process of identifying a voter is somewhat simpler than identifying someone who's eligible, because eligibility requires knowledge of their life, whereas voting requires knowledge of where they lived. The poll books are an incredible resource. However, there can be some challenges in using them. The challenge that I ran into the most was missing poll books. Sometimes they're listed in collections or archives, but when you request them, they can't be found. Also, poll books relied on a handwritten tally, and then they're later printed. So spellings of names can be slightly different or incorrect. In some cases, these misspellings will be listed and highlighted in the text of the poll book, sometimes with a list of unqualified or deceased voters. The information recorded in each poll book varies from printer to printer, between constituencies and years. There will always be the name of the voter and who their vote was cast. Other information can vary, reflecting the type of franchise. In London, in the London poll books, because the franchise was in the livery, the poll books that I looked at were organised in livery companies and the names in alphabetical order. It was usual to see part of someone's address as part of the recorded information because property was important to entitlement and it was a crucial way for me to identify an individual. I found all the identified Black MPs to have voted at least once. The two early MPs were James Townsend, who sat in Parliament for West Loo in 1767 to 1774, and Calne in 1782 to 1787, and Richard Beckford, who sat in Parliament for Bridport in 1780 to 1784, Arundel 1784 to 1790, and Leominster in 1791 to 1796. Beckford was the eldest illegitimate son of William Beckford, who was one of the wealthiest absentee planters of Jamaica. Richard Beckford had 2 failed attempts at becoming an MP before succeeding in Bridport. I couldn't find him recorded speaking in Parliament, and I was unable to find much reporting indicating his political affiliations. He was found voting in the general elections in Westminster for the years of 1777, 1780, 1784, and 1790. Townsend's voting history is a little bit more complicated because of a spelling issue. James Townsend, as well as being an MP, was elected to be an alderman of the City of London for Bishopsgate and Sheriff of the City of London in 1769. In 1772, he was elected Lord Mayor of London. Early in his political career, he was a staunch supporter of John Wilkes, and the anomaly with his voting record is I have found him voting in Middlesex and London. He voted 4 times in Middlesex in March and December of 1768, then in 1769 and 1784. He votes once in London in 1784. In the elections 1768 to 1769, his name is written with an H, so it's Townshend. The address is listed as Tottenham. I know he lived in Bruce Castle, Tottenham. Which he inherited from his wife's father, secured through his father's political connections. Townsend was an MP at the time of these elections, and he was still a supporter of Wilkes, and the voting behaviour in these elections demonstrates that. However, in the elections of 1784, his name is spelled incorrectly, casting doubt on if it is an error in spelling or a completely different person. The evidence suggests that it is a spelling error, which was quite common at the time. John Stuart and Henry Galgacus Redhead York both sat in the Reformed Parliament. Stuart sat for Leamington in 1832 and to 1832 to 1847. York sat for the City of York from 1841 to 1848. They were both found voting once. Stuart voted in the general election in Westminster in 1818, and York voted in Grantham in 1841. York was the only MP who voted after 1832, and he appeared in the voter register for Lincolnshire. The 3 voters who were not MPs were Joseph Townsend, George John Scipio Africanus, and Nathaniel Wells. Joseph Townsend was the younger brother of James Townsend. He was a medical doctor, geologist, and the rector of Pewsey in Wiltshire. He was found to have voted in the Wiltshire by-election of 1772. Discovering him as a voter led me to the eligibility of other ordained rectors and Anglican clergy who would have been given property as part of their employment with the church. I was then able to add to the list of eligible voters Brian Mackay, who was the vicar of Copes in Cambridgeshire. However, I did not find any evidence of him voting. George John Scipio Africanus was a business owner in Nottingham. He was brought to England as a small child and was baptized in 1766 and was described as a boy belonging to Benjamin of the Molyneux House, Wolverhampton. He was educated and apprenticed as a brass founder, and as an adult, he was able to move to Nottingham, where he married and started a servant agency business. He voted 3 times in Nottingham in the general election of 1818, 1820, and 1826. Finally, Nathaniel Wells was the son of William Wells, who owned 3 plantations on the island of St. Kitts. Nathaniel's mother was an enslaved woman called Jordine or Juggy, who was referred to in William's will as his woman or a house servant. Nathaniel Wells was sent to England when he was 10 under the care of his uncle, Nathaniel Wells. His father had wanted him to gain an education and go to Oxford University, although it doesn't appear that Nathaniel went to university at all. Nathaniel was the primary heir of his father's fortune, which he inherited when he turned 21. This included 3 plantations in St. Kitts and all the property and land associated. He then unwisely bought a grand estate in Monmouthshire, Piercefield Estate, over a dinner conversation. He was found to have voted in Gloucestershire, the Gloucestershire by-election of 1818, and then in Monmouthshire, general election of 1847. Wells and York are the only 2 of the 7 who voted after 1832, and with the requirement, including the requirement to register. They both voted in county elections, and they were both registered in their counties. A county registration did not incur a fee, whereas a borough registration did. York was found to have registered 3 times in the years 1838, 1840, and 1847 in Lincolnshire. Wells is found registering in every year from 1832 to 1851 in both the county of Monmouth and the Western Division of Gloucester. Okay, so some examples of poll books from different constituencies to give you an idea of how they can vary and look quite different. So in the middle, there's James Townsend. He's listed in alphabetical order and grouped in the livery company he belonged to, which is the Mercers, which is obviously on the other page because he's at the end of the list because it's Townsend. His vote doesn't appear as a mark next to his name, like in the other poll books, because this poll book was arranged as grouped as all of the voters for one of the candidates in a list, and then all of the voters for the other candidate in a list, arranged in that order. Joseph Townsend is shown in the Wiltshire poll book, which lists the parishes as well as where he lived, because it's a county borough and covers a large area, and people don't always live in the county, but they can own qualifying property. And then over on that side is Africanus, and he's shown in the Nottingham poll book, where you can say his name is listed, his occupation, which says that he's a brass founder, and his address, which is also marked with an F because he is a freeholder. Okay, so earlier I spoke about the 1731 order in the City of London that prevented Black people from joining Labour companies and therefore prevented them from voting. On this slide there is the copy of that order from the London Archives. This is because of a man called John Satir. He was born enslaved in Barbados and was brought to England as a child. He finished his apprenticeship as a joiner in 1725, and on the 7th of September 1731, he applied to become a freeman of the City of London, and he was accepted. However, on the 14th of September 1731, the council reconvened and decreed that no other Black people would be allowed to become freemen in the City of London. Satir, although, appears to have been allowed to keep his position, meaning that he would have been entitled to vote. The elections that he would have been able to vote in were 1734, 1741, and 1747. Unfortunately, the poll books for the early 18th century are scarcer, and I have not been able to locate these ones. Satir was the reason I decided to look outside of parliamentary elections, because in London specifically, elections for aldermen, London Lord Mayor and Sheriff were taking place regularly. And I was able to find a poll for the Chamberlain of City of London in 1734. But it was printed for an upcoming scrutiny of that election, and was only the voters who had voted for one of the candidates, and I'm yet to find the other half of the poll. So Satir remains the earliest eligible voter, but it is inconclusive if he actually cast a vote. And then the other image is William Cuffey, the Chartist campaigner who was transported to Tasmania in 1849. This is a sketch of him drawn in his cell in Newgate by William Dowling. He was born in Chatham, Kent. His father was born enslaved on the island of St. Kitts, and his mother was from Gillingham, Kent. He was described as having physical malformations in his legs and his back, making him notably short. He apprenticed as a tailor and moved to London around the 1834 tailors' strike. He becomes politically active and becomes a member of the Chartist Association in London. His political engagement centred around the reform of the parliamentary system, including universal male suffrage. I was unable to find him voting in any elections in Britain. However, in Tasmania, I found that he had proposed a candidate for the position of alderman for the city of Hobart in 1858. And in the same year, he was listed as an elector for the election of Mr. Adams in the same city, Hobart City, which seems fitting for someone who seems fitting for him to have finally been able to participate in elections as someone who had campaigned most of his adult life for a more fair and representative electoral system, but had been unable to exercise the vote in his home country. My research shows a methodology of finding Black voters and is evidence that 9 Black people voted, and even more than the 22 that I found would have been eligible. Black voters demonstrate that Black people had been in Britain, some for generations and others were the first, and it had been possible for some to establish themselves into British society, to the extent that they were taking part in elections. This research has shown me that some of the challenges of using archival resources, such as poll books, because they can often only show a snapshot of an individual's life, but by using sources together, you can build the story of someone's history. The group of overall 9 Black voters is currently small, but demonstrates the many areas of Black political history that are yet to be fully explored. My project was able to demonstrate multiple avenues for further research, and my database shows I was able to find 90 Black people involved in British politics between 1750 and 1850. And this chapter on voting was one of the areas I found examples of that participation. Thank you.